Okay, fantastic. Well, it's first of all, Bill, blessing to be with you tonight. It's been a rather difficult time getting online, but we're here now. That's good. So tonight's message is a rather unique one. Not everyone's cup of tea. I hope to change that. And perhaps a little bit of information about me, where I'm from. So, as John said, my name's Simon Terry. I qualified as a school teacher many years ago. Next slide, please. But I went straight into mission. So my background is effectively in the mission field. I joined London City Mission for worked and served there for a number of years. Next slide, please. In 2007, I joined Answers in Genesis as one of their speakers. Enjoyed that immensely. Next slide, please. But from 2009 to around 2020, I worked as an evangelist. And so most of my time was spent working at 5 districts in the Midlands, and that's engaging the culture and sharing the gospel of Christ. But around I suppose, if we can have the next slide, please. My love for tonight's subject goes back to my early childhood days. It was after my conversion in my late teens, I developed, should we say, a deeper appreciation for the subject. And I volunteered at London Zoo with their part to the breeding programme. I then jumped into breeding tropical land snails myself. This, in fact, is one of them, deceased. And for the past 20 years, I've been working on a project, next slide please, that studies orticology. It's a rather unique term, but it describes the relationship a specific species has, its interaction with the environment. And this creature on the screen is a Roman import. It was brought to the UK by the Romans and is actually eaten. And apparently it's very nice with garlic. I haven't had one myself, but they are quite a large animal and a delicacy. And I've been studying this creature for about 18 years and hope to one day get my work published. Next slide, please. So slugs and snails, this is a talk I've done before. It's one I like to use because it does set the scene or reset the scene. It hopefully appreciates the unappreciated. And it's called the right perspective because it's changing or hopefully challenges our attitudes to life in general. It challenges a number of different things, but specifically it will challenge our perspectives on these slimy creatures. Next slide, please. You see, maybe tonight there's a few of us here, or maybe online you're listening and you can't stand them. I meet many people who just cannot stand slugs and snails. I think slugs get a particular loathing. But for some people, it's more than that. They hate them with a passion. Perhaps they've picked up one on the compost bin and they just wish they had gardening gloves on, and their immediate reaction is to kill the creature. Well, why is that? Well, they don't like it, and that's their response, is to kill it. So it's sad reaction, but it's one that's quite common. Or maybe next slide, please. Maybe your hostas have holes in them, and your reaction is to grab the poison, the scissors, the skinks, the shotgun, and destroy every slug and snail you can find. Doesn't matter what shape or size or color it is, you want them all dead. Interesting. That's one perspective. Next slide, please. And this one's a big one. Maybe tonight you've been led to believe Darwin's window on the world, and you believe that slugs and snails and the rest of life evolved from a common ancestor. And in this case, for the slug or the snail, it's a ham, which stands for a hypothetical ancestral mollusk. Next slide, please. I believe in all of these instances, we have the completely wrong perspective on these animals. And it's my aim tonight to present to you the right perspective, the biblical foundation for these amazing animals. And so I want us, if we can, to learn to love them. And I've got three integrating points just to bring to our attention tonight. The first one, if I may, is our origin. Thank you, Sam. The next one is our special purpose, their special purpose, excuse me. And thirdly, their incredible biology. And I'm going to literally skim the surface. There's so much more to discover, but I'm going to give you the broad overview. And last of all, I'll round off with a short conclusion to our subject matter. So without further ado, let's turn to their origin. Next slide, please, Sam. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if you look at the Bible is very clear on this point. Just one look at creation, one look, and you will see clearly God's invisible. The Bible says you will see his eternal power. You will see his nature by looking at the creation. None of us, according to Apostle Paul, are without excuse. And slugs and snails are no exception. Next slide, please. The Bible is also very clear on how slugs and snails were created. And they were created according to their kinds. 10 times the Hebrew word min is used in Genesis chapter 1. And we're told, next slide please, in reference to the sea creatures, it should be verse 22, or we've managed to, there's a slide there, excuse me. So keep that slide there, thank you. So Genesis chapter 1 verse 22 tells us, in reference to sea creatures, that they'll bring forth after their kind. They'll be fruitful and multiply. So in other words, plants, animals, human beings were created to reproduce within these boundaries. And it's not difficult to work out. It really isn't. Now, this creature on the screen here is an old friend of mine. This is, I think his name is Beryl. They do carry both sexes, but I thought it was cute to give it the name Beryl. This is a slug called Orion rufus, and it's a member of a family called the Aronidae. Now, next slide, please. Thank you. So here we have the few varieties of another species, Orion ater, and both are very hard to identify one from the other, rufus and ater. And if you dissect them, you can tell the difference. But the science is obvious. These are creatures which are part of a family. They're all part of a kind, and they can interbreed. Next slide, please. Here is another Orion. Of course, not all Arians can interbreed. Only a few, Ater and Rufus, I think, can produce hybrids. But this is Orion intermedius. It's a little tiny slug. It's in the Orion family. Its common name is the hedgehog slug. When it gets scared, it can raise its tubercles on its back and pretend to be a hedgehog. That's how, obviously, our character to it. But these are the same family. And so kinds are similar species that scientists today recognize as families. Great variety in that family, but it's easy to see. It really is what family they belong to. Next slide, please. Carl von Linné is famous for his work on classification, and he gave us what I call the grand filing cabinet of life. So next slide, please. Carl von Linné classified life according to the degree of similarity. And the best way of thinking of this is to think of an index system. And as you move down that filing system, the boxes get narrower. So if you press through these, Sam, for us, the first two should come up. So then we have the kingdom box and the phylum box. The problem with this system is that it has too many boxes, and it leads to I think, a lot of confusion. So here again is our Orion rufus slug, and this slug belongs obviously in the animal kingdom. It's an animal, but that's a huge box. That's a massive box, and there are lots and lots and lots of animals, as we know. So The refinement comes when we put our slug into a slightly smaller grouping called the phylum. And for this, we have the mollusca, the mollusks. Next slide, please. This is a cuttlefish, and guess what box he is in? He is in the mollusk box. But the mollusk is a word that comes from the Latin, which from mollis, meaning soft. But the cuttlefish is not a slug. In fact, the cuttlefish is nothing like a slug. Next slide, please. This is an nautilus, and it's completely different to slugs and snails. And shockingly, this creature is also found in mollusca. They're soft, correct, but that's as far as it goes. And the textbooks will tell you they're related, but they're not. There's no direct link between the slug and the nautilus. Next slide, please. So our Orion slug is then further distilled, if you like, through these boxes, placed in a class box. Thank you, Zan. Next tab, please. Thank you. And this is the a more refined category called gastropods or gastropoda. Next slide, please. It means stomach foot. It comes from the Greek gastro meaning stomach, and poda meaning foot. And so gastropods had this muscular tum-tum on which they crawl around. But it's a massive, massive box, and we need to even move further on in our classification. Thank you, Sam. I'm going to skip past this next one. These are the stylomorphs. If you click on the next slide, please, Sam. If your eyes sit at the top of these retractable eye stems, you qualify for the stylomorph team. And so we have a huge box here, but it contains slugs and snails that have these retractable stems, these eye stems. Thank you, Sam. Next slide, please. That can include the aquatic forms as well. This next slide is perhaps where we're close to home in terms of our classification. This is the family level. And this may be the box, I think, in most cases, which typically classifies the kinds of creation. Next slide, please. This gorgeous slug is the banana slug, Aerolymax, and it's from the Pacific Northwest, and it's in that same family as our Orion rufus. It has so many similarities. And so if you click down again, please, Sam, within this family, you will find a number of genera, and that's where you get the bloom or the flare of of God's kinds. Thank you, Sam. Next slide, please. So our Orion rufus is one of many Orions that have these wonderful characteristics. Next slide, please. This is Orionata again. And again, so to cut confusion here, creation began with kinds. Genesis chapter 1 classifies them today as families. You can have great variety in that family, but it's important to make it easy to see which family these animals belong to. Now, it comes as no surprise that history that we read about in Genesis has come under great attack over the years, and particularly the 1800s. Next slide, please. Evolution in millions of years, popularized by Charles Darwin and Charles Lyell, gave us a whole new window on the world, a whole new way of thinking. You say Charles Lyell, a bit of a faceless fellow to our generation, but he is a key man to the attack on the Bible. Next slide, please. There he is. There's Charles Lyell. If you check the records, most people in England during the 1800s had a biblical worldview. They believed the scriptures' historicity and gave us 6,000 years of life. They held to a global flood in Noah's day. They had that science or that knowledge of Moses. Next slide, please. But of course, we know from the letters that have been released, I believe from Charles Lyell's sister-in-law, Charles Lyell was on a mission to get rid of that history and replace that history with his own history. He plans in this in this scheme, what will get rid of what will free the science from Moses. He talks about the mischief and the scandal brought on them by the Mosaic systems. He's referring to Moses. He's referring to the Bible here. Next slide, please. And he schemes here that if ever that geology in the Bible could be set down without giving any offense, it would be an historical sketch. I love what John said some years ago. He said, in other words, I think he said that Lyle was replacing history A with history B. And that's what the Nazis did in World War II. You change the future of the country by changing the history that people understand, how they perceive. Next slide, please. In fact, the plan worked so well that Charles Darwin confessed to his grandson in 1873 that Lyell's convinced he's shaken the faith in the deluge. That's the flood of Genesis. And he says this, by never having said a word against the Bible. This is fascinating. Under the guise of a churchman, he attacks the very foundation upon which England rested. And here's the attack. Next slide, please. The present is the key to the past. That's the philosophy which now underpins all modern science, and particularly our subject tonight of slugs and snails, would you believe? The Bible presents the complete opposite picture. The Bible shows us the past is key to understanding the present day world. Charles Lyell didn't want the history of Scripture being forefront in our minds. And so, better known, next slide, please, Sam, thank you. Here's the attack. Here's his project. Here's his philosophy of thinking, which rejects biblical history. Our present day view of the world, which is expressed in terms of millions and billions of years, has this anti-Moses, anti-Christian, anti-biblical basis to it. Next slide, please. And these pretty pictures that we get in our school textbooks are a philosophy. They're nothing to do with science whatsoever. So many scientists are aware of this hidden history of science with Lyell and Darwin. They're unaware of how we've come to arrive really truly at these pretty pictures. There's been an intent, a very anti-intent against the scriptures. That's the foundation of that philosophy. Next slide, please. And of course, Lyell's legacy is massive, it's tragic, it's even affected the way we read the book of Genesis. We've not got time to look at this in great detail tonight, but suffice to say, it's caused many to compromise the plain contextual reading of the Bible. Now, my purpose tonight is to be faithful to the text and show you how what we observe in creation actually is hand in glove with what we read in the biblical record. Next slide, please. Lyell's legacy has left a serious wake. The train of advocates to this philosophy stretches miles. David Attenborough had made a very broad statement in his series Life in the Undergrowth. And he was seen wandering through a lovely, well-stocked English garden, and he alights on some sleeping garden snails. And he comments, many of the mollusks in the sea develop shells to protect themselves from predators. But on land, those shells serve just as well to keep the occupant nice and moist. So, without any major change to their anatomy, mollusks were able to creep up out of the water and graze in the forests of algae and mosses that were then spreading over the land. And given the right conditions, they still do. Well, I've got a problem with that, because for a snail to leave the ocean for life on land requires a major change in their anatomy. A terrestrial lung is very different to a gill. The leap to a lung requires meaningful, specified, complex, coded instructions. This supposed marine ancestry has never ever been observed, ever been recorded. And given the right conditions, they can't, because they're different kinds. So what do we actually observe? Well, I've observed it myself. Next slide, please. There are snails that live in the sea called prosoprancs. The common periwinkle uses gills to breathe, and it keeps water within its mantle cavity so the gills can function when the tide goes out. It's an amazing design. So these are the periwinkles. Next slide, please. And this is another example of one of those sea snails, and close up, and you can see the body coming out there. They are an amazing little creature. Next slide, please. But there are other winkles, like this one, the land winkle, that are not equipped for life at sea at all. The breathing apparatus for this land winkle is very, very different. And again, Genesis reminds us that these creatures on land and sea were created independently from each other. Next slide, please. And it's not just the lungs that need changing. This is an air-breathing pond snail, the Neostagnalis. It breathes air like our land winkle, but it lives in water. If you take it out of the water, it dies. There's so much more to their sophisticated biology than truly meets the eye. Its home is the water, but it breathes air as a lung. Next slide, please. And there are slugs that live in the sea that have gills, the epistobranchs. Next slide, please. And there are slugs that live on the land that breathe air, like our Orion rufus. And it's easy to see how different they are and which belongs in which group or kind. Next slide, please. Contrary to what media will tell you and secular scientists will tell you, we all have the same science. Next slide, please. Specifically, and this is the root of the word here, science means to have knowledge or state of knowing. Science means knowledge, that's all it means. Next slide, please. And so observational science is a science that deals with the stuff you can observe. Next slide, please. That's why we can build things like aircraft and, next slide, please, launch satellites into the heavens. Next slide, please. But when that scientist who digs up dinosaur bones using that same science speaks of millions of years, he's just left the science he can see, obviously. Next slide, please. And he's jumped into history, historical science. You can't see the past. The past is gone. David Attenborough, with great respect to him, didn't see marine snails, leaving life in the ocean for life on land. You can't test that science. You can't repeat that science. It's unobservable. Next slide, please. And it's your starting point tonight that determines how you'll use the data, how you'll read the evidence, how you'll understand the past. And ultimately, there are only two real bases here. Either you start with the revealed history, the testament of the Bible, the one who's always been there, knows everything, or you trust the speculations of human wisdom, the ideas, and that's all they are, of men like Charles Darwin and Charles Lyell, who want to rewrite the past because they hate God. That's the truth of the matter. Next slide, please. And it's so exciting because when you start with the science or use the science you can see, and this is one aspect I love about creation research, it always confirms the real history of life in the scriptures. That is the history, the science you can't see. Next slide, please. This project, Evolution Mega Lab, it spanned Europe for many years, and it sought to train up children to think like Charles Darwin. And guess what they used? They used snails. Next slide, please. The website opens. Welcome to Evolution Mega Lab. Do you know that thanks to a common little snail you can find in your garden, in the park or under a hedge, you can, and now please watch this word, you can see evolution in your own backyard. Next slide, please. This activity introduces pupils to Darwin's ideas on evolution by looking at variation, adaptation, and distribution of banded snails. So here we have, it's very interesting this, we have variation number one, we have adaptation number two, and distribution of banded snails that gives us evolution. Okay, let's just see if we can see this. Next slide, please. So here we have a typical banded snail. There's two main varieties in the UK. We have the white lips, the brown lips. It's the brown lips, and they're polymorphic. Next slide, please. So they have different colours, banding, that's shell stripes, as adults. They're exquisite little things. And this variation is clearly typical of the species. There's no conflict here whatsoever with the Bible. Actually, it's what you expect to see, given they're reproducing after their kind. They're producing banded snails in great variety. Next slide, please. So observations on this megalab conclude this. Darker shell types tend to be more common in woodland, but the background colour is brown. Next slide, please. And here's my test example. I've been there, got the t-shirt, got the photograph. Here it is. Observations conclude that. Good science so far. But I'm not seeing evolution. I'm seeing simply a variant in the same kind. Next slide, please. Evolution Megalab says, while in grassland, the banded snails tend to be lighter coloured, yellow, and have more stripes. This camouflage is an example of adaptation. Next slide, please. Again, this is a good observation. And that's where we find, and this kind of snail survives well in grassland. So there's an effect called the albedo effect, where lighter shells reflect light differently. But again, I'm not seeing any evolution whatsoever. Next slide, please. There's been a big decrease in the numbers of song thrushes in some places over the past 30 years. Next slide, please. So depending on where you live, these predators, the song thrush, have been in decline, and yes, may indeed affect the distribution of these wonderful little snails. But again, I'm not seeing evolution whatsoever. Next slide, please. Darker shells, I love this. Darker shells used to be more common in the north and in the south. Again, more great science. It's a great observation. But finding lighter coloured snails in the north of the country is a trend I jump on. It's great science, but I'm still left begging the question, where is this evolution I'm supposed to be observing? Next slide, please. And here's the wrap. You get this? Okay, so evolution is a very slow process. Life on Earth started about 3.5 billion years ago. It's the tiny changes accumulating over a long time that got us here. And you can see some of those tiny steps by joining Evolution Megalab. Here's my problem. Those tiny changes are what I'd expect to see. Differences, yes. Changes, yes. But within the kind, they're still banded snails. I'm not seeing any evolution whatsoever. Evolution postulates that one kind will transform into a completely different kind. But did you catch the catch? It takes so long to happen, you wouldn't expect to see it. Next slide, please. Mr. Dawkins, in a debate with our dear John, said this: you're using the word see as meaning see within one lifetime. If a phenomenon takes millions of years, of course you are not going to see it. Next slide, please. In an interview with Bill Moyers, he said evolution has been observed, it's just it hasn't been observed while it's happening. And there's the catch. You wouldn't expect to see it because it takes so long to happen. Ipso facto, you do not see it. That's the reality. Next slide, please. Famous quote, Dr. Kemp. To account for evolutionary changes that take millions of years to completion, solely by reference to processes that can be studied over tens of years, requires what? An extraordinary faith. And indeed it is extraordinary. Next slide, please. Next tab, please, Sam. Thank you. So when you look at those lovely snails and use the same science, you can clearly see, no guesswork, they do exactly as God said they do. They bring forth after their kind, and children are entitled to know that. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide, please, Sam. Thank you. One of the great fun projects I've done at home is called Spot the Difference. And you can go to a stretch of hedgerow, our garden plot, and discover how many colours and bands you can find in that one species. Genesis chapter 1 in your backyard, not evolution. And to God be the glory, not Charles Darwin. Next slide, please. Now, I'll close this little first part this of the evening with one of my favourite slugs called the testacella. These are subterranean slugs. They hunt and eat earthworms, and they have a small shell plate on their tail. If you look at the top of the picture there, you'll see a little plate. That's the slug's tail. And these slugs are, next slide please, are all very similar. They own this distinctive shell plate. Next slide please. Thank you. We have observed the introduction of a similar slug in recent years called the ghost slug, Sleeliclinus, but that does lack a tail plate. But it is a hunter and lives underground. Next slide, please. Evolution postulates that life underground made necessary the reduction of the cumbersome shell, which as a result, and it goes on, leaves this particular family with the only meagre rest of a glassy shell carried at the tip of the tail. A similar thing happened to the snails of the Testacelidae during their evolution. Again, this supposed loss no one has ever observed. We do find tail-plated slugs, but it's a giant leap of faith to conclude they once lived inside them. Next slide, please. So what we observe, actually, is what Genesis has been telling us all along. The record is the reality, and all we observe supports that. They bring forth after their kinds. Next slide, please. Little note of caution here. These elusive slugs carry these sharp harpoon-like radula. When they use it on your hand, it's excruciating. A friend of mine was holding one once, and it bit her, and the effect was excruciatingly painful. So please watch yourself if you find one of these little slugs crawling around your back garden. So we've gone from their origin, and now I want to look at, if I may, their purpose, the purpose of these amazing animals. Next slide, please, Sam. And they do have an amazing purpose. Let me fly you, if I may, to the foggy forests of Western North America. Next slide, please. These forests are incredibly beautiful. Coastal redwoods, one day I'd like to go. When I say giant, we're talking about trees 90 meters high. Next slide, please. They are truly enormous trees. And one of the very unique features of these forests, next slide, please, is the famous fog drip that accounts for 40% of the water found in these forests. I'm sure Craig knows a thing or two about these trees. During warm coastal weather, you have a belt of fog that moves from the coast inland some 25 miles. And during the early hours of the morning, the fog condenses and gets trapped in the upper story foliage. And the redwoods, they capture more than they need. And so the fog drip provides refreshment for all the lower understory vegetation and creatures that live in these forests. Without these tall trees to catch the fog, the forest would change detrimentally. And so when you find damage done to your redwood seedlings, you need to find the culprit. Next slide, please. There was a research project undertaken in California, and they sought to identify the cause of the damage of these young redwood seedlings. And from one giant to another, the huge gigantean banana slug was the suspected villain. Next slide, please. And there was an experiment devised where they they had a number of slugs they put together, and they kept these slugs in a box, and they didn't feed the slugs but left them with the seedlings. And what happened was the slugs ate up all the little fungi and other plants that grew in between these redwood seedlings, but never touched the seedlings. They're protecting young trees from other plants that were competing for light, competing for space, and of course, nutrients. They were protecting actually these seedlings from competition. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And this is the power of this biome, is that these wonderful slugs literally clean the forest floor. It's part of the design. They consume roots and seeds and bulbs and flowers and ferns. Even the poison oak, which is toxic to human beings, these slugs will eat. They'll eat animal droppings, they'll eat carcasses, and that's something we just can't do ourselves. These are creatures designed to do what they do, and they do it extremely well. And of course, their scats they produce are rich in nitrogen, and they'll provide fertilizer for the forest. Next slide, please. And as the trees mature, they provide the damp conditions upon which this slug and so many other animals and plants are dependent. Next slide, please. And there's so much more. Other seeds and spores that are consumed by these slugs will work their way through the digestive tract, and they'll be dispersed with their droppings, and they'll provide future plants for the forest, which in turn feed the banana slugs who serve them in the first place. It's amazing. I find it absolutely amazing the vital role these slugs play in the life of the forest, and in particular their contribution to the life of the giant redwood. Next slide, please. It does get a bit revealing. 2 years ago, or not 2 years, excuse me, many years ago, there's sort of news reports that were flashing about monster slugs from the Iberian Peninsula that were swarming across Britain, fueled by rain. And this is a slug which has threatened food security. Orion vulgaris. And in mainland Europe, would you believe these particular slugs? Next slide, please. Here's the creature. These slugs, they are comical. They have become a highway hazard. Entire roads have been closed off because of their cannibalistic tendency. Any slug that is killed becomes a magnet to munch on, and so you get these roads covered in a slimy slick as all these slugs get crushed by the cars. But again, it's just showing us here that the creation's not working as it should be. There's problems. Next slide, please. We've looked at the flesh-eating testacella and the ghost slug. Next slide, please. There are other flesh eaters like the cone snails. Next slide, please, Sam. These are a family of sea snails called Toxoblossa, which means poisoned tongue. They have a tongue like yours and mine that comes out their heads, and at the tip of their tongue they have a hypodermic needle, which they can reload like a bolt-action rifle. And one of those conids, this one here is the geographer's cone, or that's in fact the textile cone, I think. Bit confused there. The geographer's cone. Next slide, please. Here we are. The geographer's cone is one which is highly toxic. It's been responsible for at least 30 human fatalities. One such attack was back in June of 1935. A young, very fit football player was heading for Hayman Island, the coast of Queensland. Tropical waters, lovely crystal clear. He heads back to from the reef, and he handles a geographer's cone. The creature did inject him, and it wasn't long before the poor chap left this life. Death took place hours after he was stung. Here's a point which I've not provided until this point, but it brings a whole new perspective on life, doesn't it? Please turn back to Genesis chapter 1. Next slide, please. Genesis records that the creation at the end of it was very good. And that includes all the slugs and snails that God created. Next slide, please. And the change we've seen, the change of history, which changes everything. Man's rebellion has brought death into the world. Cone snails killing people was not part of the original very good creation. In fact, in Romans chapter 8, next slide, please, we're reminded it was our sin in Adam that led the world into corruption and futility. Paul makes this very, very clear. Many of us fail to realize the trouble these cone snails bring, and land slugs causing highway hazards is because of our rebellion. The world has changed. The world is not the world once created. I think the sad thing is we've been programmed to think like Charles Darwin. Cone snails killing people is just part of life. It's not. It's a corrupted world. It's a world that's broken. And I marvel at a society that hangs its worldview on the ideas of a man over the word of God. I marvel at that. Next slide, please. The right perspective we should have, because of our right foundation, is one of thankfulness and remorse. Thankfulness that these amazing creatures process our land, and of course, remorseful. The world is not the world it once was because of man's rebellion. And that's where we rest our second point for this evening, the ultimate point in their special purpose. And I've got a quote, if I may, from Mr. Ken Ham. Next slide, please. Even what man considers to be one of the lowliest of animals is in fact an exquisite and marvelous testimony to the handiwork of our Creator God, invoking a deep sense of awe, wonder, and praise. Next slide, please. Okay, excuse me. Just going to get my notes around here. So, our next slide is looking at the study of these creatures. Next slide, please. If you go to Psalm 143, verse 5, we're reminded of David's meditation on the works of God. He is musing on the work of God's hands. He looks back at what God has done. David was a man taken up with God. Next slide, please. And in Job 37, God himself counsels a man called Job to listen, to stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. There's an old silent film, next slide please, called Microcosmos from 1996, and I love the song that's played. Look at your feet. Open your eyes before you die. Sit on the grass, observe and paint. In other words, look at the window of the created world and marvel. Marvel at that world. Next slide, please. Oh, that shouldn't be there. Next slide, please. Oh, slide's gone missing. If you go back a slide, please, Sam. There should be a slide there, but it's gone. Okay, so I want to just have a look at this marvel for a moment. There's so much I'm going to miss, but I'm going to cover a sort of broad brush here with these amazing animals, give you a little window into their biology. So here you can see one of the banded snails, and if you look at the top eye stems there, they're optical. The bottom set are sensory. They're chemical. They have chemical sense. Next slide, please. Slugs have the same. They carry the same apparatus. Next slide, please. Oh, this is the slide I missed out. This is the African land snail, and again, slug or snail, they both carry these eye stems. They can see vision in part, but not as good as we can. Next slide, please. Some snails have their eyes at the base of their tentacles. If you look at this pond snail here, they can't retract them, but the eyes are at the base. They're quite different to our stylomorphs. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now for feeding, this is an amazing bit of kit. It really is, the radula. It's an organ that looks a little bit like an elastic band, and it's armed with rows and rows and rows of sharp, backward pointing teeth. And in some cases, 27,000 of them. And they can replace these like a shark. And this rasping band works in concert, next slide please, with a jaw. This is the banana slug here, and it's chomping on a leaf. And the jaw and the radula work a little bit like a guillotine. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not too sure this works, Sam, your end. It probably doesn't work. No, this is the film I got of a West African species of tropical land snail, and this will show the radula in place, but we can't show that film. Next slide, please. This is the brown-lipped snail, just reaching adulthood. When they get to adulthood, they have a brown or dark ridge on the base of their shell, and it's grazing on algae. Particular favorite food of these particular snails. Next slide, please. And this was taken many years ago from my children's play set, and you've got the radula marks there on the play set cover of the land snail. Next slide, please. Now, this is an old picture of one of my land snails from West Africa. The top orange bar, that's the jaw, and the bottom, it's the bottom set there. That's the radula that comes up. Thousands of tiny teeth. I've got a sound clip. I'm not too sure I can show it. I can't show it to you, Sally, tonight, but I'll play it to you. But there's a clip I've got of the radula rasping against plastic. One night I was in the office working, and one of these land snails was chomping at the plastic. It was very, very loud. It's an incredible bit of hardware. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'll go past this one. Next slide, please. So the radula on this dog whelk has been used with a softening chemical to bore holes in its prey. And sadly, for some strange reason, another whelk has preyed upon another whelk. That hole has been made by another whelk. They're predatory. Next slide, please. Here's a hole in a mussel shell I found some years ago, with the dog whelk was in the very process of drilling through into the mussel to eat. Quite a unique, again, piece of equipment. Next slide, please. This is a very voracious predator. This is called the rosy wolf snail, Euglandina rosea. It's part of a family of wolf snails, if you like, that have this amazing radula. So it has a long esophageal tube from its head, which houses these very long radula that slice through flesh, which will suck into its stomach, and they actually do eat other snails, and they've been known to go underwater in search of pond snails. Next slide, please. Land snails and slugs have a lung. Can you spot the hole on the mantle shield of this Orion slug? That's called the pneumostome. The slug actually breathes through this pore, which you can open and close. And so if you look inside that pore, you are looking at this slug's equivalent of a lung. Next slide, please. This is the Roman snail, which I've been studying, and you can see the pneumostome on the underneath the shell there, on the right-hand side, just beneath the shell's lip. Next slide, please. Sea slugs and other slugs in the sea, they breathe through gills, which are found at the back of the animal. And if you ever look at these creatures, they've got an amazing way of using their prey items. These slugs eat hydroids, and hydroids have stinging cells. And the slugs manage to eat the hydroids and use their cells in their gills to sting predators. And they've never been to chemistry class. Absolutely amazing. Next slide, please. These are the periwinkles we saw earlier, and they have gills hidden within the shell and in their mantle cavity. And they'll use that cavity when the tide goes out to remain alive. It's filled with water so they can breathe. Next slide, please. Some snails are amphibious, like these apple snails. They can actually leave the water for in search of food. Now, these have a lung and a gill, so they can use a special siphon if they're submerged in murky water where the oxygen is quite low. They're like a snorkel. It's an amazing bit of kit. Next slide, please. Slugs and snails are known for their slime. They produce a lot of slime for a number of different reasons, and the pedal gland highlighted here in this banana slug produces slime that enables the slug to crawl over a number of different surfaces, even razor sharp surfaces. Next slide, please. Now my film isn't working tonight, so I'll go to the next slide, please. It's one thing to have slime. It's a whole different thing to have the ability to use that slime to your advantage. And the foot is a genius piece of creation. Slugs are able to manipulate that slime so they can crawl over almost any terrain. It's an amazing body plan that works extremely well. Next slide, please. We've tried to duplicate that ourselves with robo snail or robo slug, but again, it's dwarfed by the mastery seen in the creation of the gastropods. Next slide, please. Now, slime has amazing properties, and they've just been on this for some time actually. The Chilean snail farmers found that their skin healed quite quickly when they handled snails to the French food market. And so now there are various creams and lotions that use snail slime to soothe and regenerate and heal skin. Even combat things like acne, reduce pigmentation, scarring, and even wrinkles. Happy days. Next slide, please. And some slime can be dangerous in a dangerous way. The banana slugs, if you step on one, literally work like banana skins. And so in parts of California, you find these signs up to warn you that these slugs are dangerous. Their bodies are, next slide please. Thank you. So their bodies are covered in sensory cells that enables them to literally taste their way through the forest floor. Slugs are rather unique in that their body is covered in nerve cells as well, so they can react to light and darkness from all different angles. They can detect changes in temperature, and more than any other creature actually. They're plugged and wired into seasonal changes that I find absolutely amazing. Next slide, please. Now, if you're a snail, you can use slime to your advantage when it gets rather dry, and snails can use this by they'll seal their shell with a layer of mucus, and that will form a film that allows the snail to breathe but prevents the snail from drying out. Next slide, please. This is the Roman snail, and that has a rather unique way of passing through winter. That will produce an epiphragm, that's white plate you can see on the shell there. It will produce that to a bit like double glazing. It protects it from the harshness of winter. Next slide, please. One common feature in sea snails, and you do find it also in some land snails, is called the operculum, and that's an organic trapdoor that sits on the tail of the creature. So when it's crawling along and it's worried or concerned, scared, it will withdraw into its shell and be protected. And of course, when the tide rolls out, it prevents the creature from being desiccated. Next slide, please. They're known for their beauty. There's quite something special about the shell. Maybe you've enjoyed shell collecting at the beach on holiday. In Guadeloupe, these conch shells are known as the queen conch, and they're edible. So these are, again, another sea snail you can eat, locally known as lombi. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there's a beautiful helix structure of the Roman snail shell. Next slide, please. Also known as Spira mirabilis, or the miraculous spiral. Jacob Bernoulli in the 1600s was fascinated by these unique mathematical properties. The size of the spiral increases, but the shape remains unaltered with each successive curve. And if you step back further to 12th and 13th century, there was the Italian mathematician Fibonacci, who popularized, next slide please, the famous Fibonacci sequence, or I think it's where you have numbers 0 and 1 are followed by each subsequent number being the sum of the previous two. And you can draw these arcs connecting the corners, and you get this beautiful pattern developing. Quite special. Next slide, please. And the construction of the shell is a builder's dream. It really is. There's layers that serve a special purpose. It's a true marvel. It really is. If you look at the top layer there in the light brown gold, that's an organic skin called the periostracum. That can wear off. In fact, if you pick up a snail, look underneath it, and that's where you'll find some wear and tear. The next layer is called the ostracum, and that has two layers to it, two calcareous layers. There's a prismatic layer that's packed quite tightly across the top there, and then a plate layer which further serves stability. And last of all, there's this sort of nacreous layer or hypostracum inside the shell. And next slide, please. If a snail, for example, gets trod on, the snail can repair itself. It can take some beating. The snail will slowly over time use that nacreous layer to build up inside and repair the damage. These snails aren't impervious, but they do wonderfully repair themselves given time. So if you do happen to tread on the snail, leave it alone. It'll crawl away, hopefully, and repair itself. Next slide, please. Inside is a world of molecular machinery, and this is a very crude picture, really, of the complexity you find inside the shell of the snail. Slugs and snails are cold-blooded. Their blood is pale blue, copper-based, unlike ours. Towards the apex of the shell there, you'll see the liver. You've got the kidney, the mantle, the heart, and of course the lung cavity. And also superbly placed and positioned to fulfill their function and purpose in life. Next slide, please. As we close here, it's a quick walk through their life cycle, which you might find interesting. Here's a clutch I took many years ago of some Roman snail eggs just been laid. The adult will excavate a egg chamber and then lay a large clutch of eggs. Most slugs and snails you'll find are hermaphrodites. They carry both male and female reproductive apparatus, and both will, in some, well, not all, but most will lay eggs afterwards. Next slide, please. This is the Gold Coast snail, one of the African giants my daughters held many years ago. And this reproduced without another snail. Next slide, please. Here are the eggs, quite exquisite. Next slide, please. And when they actually hatch with a shell. Some folk find that quite unusual, but they actually hatch with a shell. Next slide, please. In this African Gold Coast snail, this is a hatchling that was produced without any without any mating involved. Quite an exquisite find. I was in my office one day. I had eggs in there. I knew were needed to be taken out the enclosure, and lo and behold, one of them hatched. I was quite surprised. This snail had been kept alone for years without any other contact with any other snail. Next slide, please. This is Achatina auriguli. This is one of the African species. They don't lay eggs, but they give birth to live, mobile baby snails. I was given one of these, I think it was through London Zoo many years ago. Woke up one morning and I had 20 lies staring at me. Quite shocking. They give birth to live young. Next slide, please. The pond snails lay eggs in a soft jelly, which is often attached to plants. Next slide, please. These are whelk eggs, I think now vacated. These are laid around January on our coastlines, and they sometimes get washed ashore. If the egg case has a yellow colour to it, you might find some baby whelks still inside. Next slide, please. And these beautiful bead-like eggs belong to the apple snail. And they lay their eggs above the waterline, and they won't hatch if they're submerged. Next slide, please. This is a sea slug, and it's laying these beautiful flat ribbons. The eggs of sea slugs will develop either directly into small crawling baby slugs, or they'll emerge indirectly into these what's called veliger larvae. Next slide, please. And here's one example. It's planktonic larval form, which will develop later into a juvenile sea slug. This is a sea hare you'll find in certainly British coastlines, and there's a huge one that was in California. Next slide, please. After about 6 weeks, half weeks, these tiger slugs will hatch, and they're left to fend for themselves. Next slide, please. And after 2 or 3 weeks, you will find the banding appears on the adults. Next slide, please. These are banana slug eggs and a young hatchling. Again, it takes a few days for the slug to get its colour, but from a very early age, you can identify the species. Next slide, please. This is one I took nearly 20 years ago now. This is a typical Orion rufus. You can see on the back of the tail there a little pit called the caudal mucus pit. That's a key ID for these particular Arionid slugs. Next slide, please. This is a very young Roman snail, and these will take about 2 or 3 years, can do, to reach full maturity. In their first autumn, they'll burrow down, produce a lovely epiphragm, and they'll go through the seasons. Next slide, please. Before they reach adulthood. And what's surprising, next slide, please, Sam, thank you. What's so surprising about these snails, and I did mention this earlier, is the way they build these amazing screens for the winter. This is porous. It allows the snail to breathe. It also allows the snail to vent away waste gases. It also waterproofs the creature. And these epiphragms enable the snail to maintain an internal humidity at a very comfortable range. And in this case, the Roman snail, the snail impregnates that epiphragm with chalk. I find the process of hibernation with these particular snails absolutely amazing. They make their own antifreeze. They get rid of unwanted water and large proteins in their blood to break them down into smaller molecules. And the heartbeat will slow down from 34 beats per minute to around 3 to 4 beats per minute. And despite losing 50% of their body weight, I find amazing, after 7 months of dormancy, they'll emerge in April and replenish their losses. It's a truly remarkable process that always blows my mind. And there's so much more to discover. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And whether it's woods or climbs, next slide, please, or rock pools, next slide, please, or your local park or garden, I encourage you, you'll be amazed at what lives there when you start lifting up stones. Why not plan to have a slug hunt one night and see what's crawling around your back garden? You'll be amazed. And of course, they are amazing pets, and people give me a sideways look when I say that, but it's true. They are amazing pets. They're charming, actually, and you can learn loads. They won't fetch your slippers. If they did, it would take some time. Next slide, please. I've discovered tons by literally watching them as a young boy growing up. And this is a slug I reared many years ago. Next slide, please. That produces frost-resistant eggs. The slug died in my shed of old age. The eggs were laid and they were rock solid, and they emerged when the weather changed. Absolutely amazing. Next slide, please. And the babies, next slide, please, Sam. Sorry, 2 slides there. The babies, when they emerge, are lovely pale cream. And next slide, please. They'll turn to a shade of brown. And this particular species, when reaching adulthood, slowly began to lose that brown texture and color. And this next slide, please. This beautiful Satsuma orange just was just so bright and incredibly vibrant as it changed. It's an amazing process to see from this juvenile stage, adult stage, how the slug changed color. Absolutely amazing. I encourage you to find an Aryan slug and watch it for a while. They're amazing animals. Next slide, please. And of course, there's a famous giant African land snails, and I'm a big fan of these. And they don't bark, they don't smell, no huge vet bills, and they won't eat you out of house and home. And they'll teach you a lot about life in the slow lane. They really will. Next slide, please. Well, I want to just wrap up our thoughts tonight with some thoughts from the scriptures. Job chapter 12, verse 7. I think that's the wrong reference, actually. Ask the beasts and they'll teach you. Ask the birds of the air and they'll tell you. Speak to the earth and it will teach you. And the fish of the sea will explain to you. Next slide, please. Who among all these does not know the hand of the Lord has done this? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think it's also easy to get the wrong perspective. It's also easy to have the wrong attitude to life. And I think slugs and snails are a wonderful example of how we get it so wrong. Next slide, please. But what about us? What about your perspective on humanity? You know, if you get this wrong, if you get this perspective wrong, it's serious. If we can't answer this question of identity, who we are, then it leads to all kinds of problems. Like, for example, next slide, please. We live in a world, don't we, where there's joy and sorrow side by side. Why is that? Next slide, please. We live in a world where there's love and hate side by side. Why is that? Next slide, please. We live in a world where there's life and death. What's your perspective on that? How do you answer that? How do you see that? Next slide, please. Well, when you start with this foundation, you get corrective vision. Isaiah 59, verse 2. Next slide, please, Sam. Says, your iniquities have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you. Next slide, please. Our sin is the reason why there's hate in the world. It's the reason why there's sorrow, why there's death, why there's groaning and corruption. The Bible says the creation itself groans because of us. It's corrupted because of us. Our sin has brought the world to futility. Next slide, please. Sin is an old-fashioned word, but it's the breaking of God's law, like the Ten Commandments. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. We are commanded by God not to lie, but we do. Next slide, please. Lying lips, says Proverbs, are an abomination to the Lord. An abomination, lying lips. And Jesus warned in Matthew 12, next slide, please, that every idle word men shall speak, they'll give account on the day of judgment. Next slide, please. But God's clear, the Bible's clear, that God's not willing any of us perish beyond this life, but we change our thinking. I love this verse. He's not willing any perish, but all should come to repentance. Repentance is an old-fashioned word. It means to change your mind. Change your mind towards God. Change your mind, your perspective towards sin. And change your mind, your perspective towards Jesus. Next slide, please. Change your mind and recognize that without trusting the work of Christ, man faces an eternal hell for his sins. That's the punishment we deserve, isn't it? We've broken his world. We've messed up his planet. And why should anyone face the end of that road when God has given us his one and only Son? We broke the law, but Jesus paid for that in full. And the Bible declares tonight that all those who trust in him as Lord and Saviour pass from death to life. Next slide, please. If you've not put your trust tonight in Christ, I encourage you to do so. Don't ever leave it. I remember these words I read that led to my salvation some 26 years ago. If you live without Christ, you will die without Christ. And if you die without Christ, you'll spend eternity without Christ. The Bible says, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Make sure you make your peace with God and have renewed thinking. Next slide, please. We speak about perspectives tonight, and we speak about realities. God is in the business of transforming our minds. I read a poem some years ago. It goes like this. How manifold are the works of the Lord. In wisdom he made them all. The earth is full of his possessions, including slugs, both great and small. To God be the glory. Amen.